Greetings, everyone. I am very excited and honored today to be in conversation with John Stuart Reid. And thank you for being here today, John.
It's a great pleasure, Heather. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Let me just give a brief bio and then we'll launch into our conversation together.
Sure.
John Stuart Reid is an acoustics physics scientist and pioneer in cymatics and in the understanding of sound therapy and how it can improve our health naturally, which is something I really want to get into with you. He has been working in the field of acoustics for 50 years and is an expert in cymatic science and is the inventor of the phenomenal Cymascope that allows us to see visually the images created by sound and vibration, and is now being used in so many fields. It's extraordinary. So I am very excited to be in conversation with you today, John, and hear more about your research. And I'd love to start with how you got into this, really focusing on this study and developing the Cymascope from your experience in Egypt.
I'd love to share about that. I'll try to be succinct because I very often I'm not succinct. I go off onto all sorts of side alleys. So please bring me back if I do that. I have actually had two careers. The first career was that of an acoustics engineer, and I ran my own acoustics engineering company, and that actually ran for 30 straight years. And it was very successful, kind of a small company, about 20 staff, that kind of size, but very successful in its field. And but towards the end of that 30-year period in my life, which kind of turned out to be an apprenticeship in a way, towards the end of it in 1997, so this is like 2 years before I closed that business, I was in Egypt with my daddy and had an experience in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. We had been in the Great Pyramid many times. We were in the past, but never alone. And in this particular case, we found ourselves completely alone. And it was an amazing experience because, well, you've been there, Heather, and the acoustics in that chamber are really special, very, very special, and certainly gave me the impression at that time that they had been designed. It felt like they had been designed. Anyway, I lay in the sarcophagus because we were alone, not with other people, and it was very fortunate. It wasn't something we'd planned. It was just lucky, really. And I lay in the sarcophagus, which is something I'd always wanted to do. It's a bit naughty, of course. I don't think the Egyptian authorities really would like to see people doing that. But of course, millions of other people have done it. Anyway, from an acoustics engineering point of view, I wanted to do it simply to see if I could understand something about the resonances of that granite box. Now, I use this word resonances very carefully, because it's a term that gets overused and wrongly used, actually. People go into the King's Chamber and call it resonant, and that's a mistake. The chamber itself, the King's Chamber, is highly reverberant, which basically simply means that the sounds that you make in that chamber come back to your ears at slightly different times, because they're being reflected from the walls at different and causing different time paths to your ears. So you're receiving the same sound that you make, but like with multiple reflections. That's called reverberance. And the King's Chamber has it in spades. I mean, it's, as you know, it's highly reverberant. But many people would use the term resonance. No. Resonance concerns an object that is moving, say, under the influence of sound, physically moving. Well, the walls of the King's Chamber, the floor, the ceiling are made of granite blocks, which are so massive. I mean, like the blocks of the ceiling, for example, weigh 75 tons each. And these are big spans across the ceiling. They can't move under the influence of sound. They're so solid and massive. So, but what can move is the sarcophagus. Now, the sarcophagus is a box of granite. It's obviously was originally a monolithic block of granite that was hollowed out to make a sarcophagus. In other words, a form of coffin for all the world. Originally, it would have had a lid. Now that lid is lost in antiquity. No one knows what happened to the lid. And also the southeastern corner is quite badly broken away, but actually it doesn't stop that break damage doesn't stop the sarcophagus being highly resonant. So remember, this term resonant means an object will physically move with sound. And that's exactly what the sarcophagus walls do. So the walls are, several inches thick of granite. And you would think, well, how can something that's several inches thick made of granite move? Well, it does. It really does move under the influence of sound. If you strike the side of the sarcophagus with your fist, which again is a bit naughty, but it doesn't really do any damage to the sarcophagus, it rings like a low-pitched bell, has a beautiful, rich sound. Where does this richness come from? Well, it comes from the fact that granite, especially Aswan granite, so this is literally from Aswan, where this pink or rose-colored granite was originally quarried, that granite has quite a high percentage of quartz crystal, about 20% quartz crystal. And that makes it highly resonant. As you know, all crystals have resonant properties. And in this case, it makes the sarcophagus very resonant. So when you make sound in the king's chamber, for example, I now know from all of the research that I did subsequently in the king's chamber with acoustics instrumentation, that a large percentage of that sound that you make vocally in the king's chamber is acoustically coupled into the sarcophagus. And this is not an accident. And I can tell you more about that, why that is not an accident. It's designed to do that. But anyway, so I have gone off on a bit of a tangent here, but coming back to, me lying in the sarcophagus, what I did that day was to make a vocal glissando and, just like kind of a smooth, unstepped enunciation of a single tone. And the purpose of that was to establish ballpark, where is the peak resonant frequency of the sarcophagus, right? And my ears told me it was somewhere over 100 hertz. I don't have perfect pitch, so I wasn't able to, in that little experiment, I wasn't able to actually determine the actual frequency. But what did happen that changed my life forever was that I experienced a really strange tingling in my whole body. All my cells seemed to tingle and goosebumps broke out all over my flesh. It was I think it was because such a kind of strange experience that I, having been an acoustics engineer at that point, almost 30 years, and yet never experienced anything quite like that. So it really got my attention. And so cutting a very long story short, eventually, I determined that I would go back to the pyramid and I would take acoustics instrumentation to discover the actual frequency at which this strange effect had happened. And so I did exactly that. And so basically, I conducted 2 sets of experiments in the king's chamber. The first set of experiments were very standard acoustics experiments, like any acoustics engineer would recognize, finding like a pink noise test and various other tests to establish the resonant properties of the sarcophagus and the acoustic coupling I mentioned between the king's chamber and the sarcophagus, all these kind of standard acoustics tests. But the second series of experiments, which was conducted the next year, were all based on cymatics, because, cymatics is the science of visible sound. And while I had used a spectrum analyzer in the first set of experiments, this is kind of a graphic view of sound, you could say, graphically seeing sound. But I really wanted to use this relatively new science as it was emerging then in the 90s. Cymatics is the science of visible sound, and simply means that whenever sound is visible is present, and there's a membrane present, then there must be a pattern of acoustic energy imprinted on that membrane. Right? Mm-hmm. It's invisible; you can't see it, but it must happen. The laws of physics tell us so. Right? So to make it visible in cymatic principles, one simply sprinkles on some revealing medium. If we're talking about a membrane and particulate matter, then you just sprinkle on some powder. It's a little bit like, I liken this to a fingerprint, actually, in forensic science, where you make a fingerprint or a thumbprint on a glass, it's virtually invisible, unless you really know it's there and look carefully for it under strong light, you just won't see it. But if you sprinkle on some talcum powder, wow, immediately the fingerprint or the thumbprint becomes visible. Well, it's kind of similar to that with cymatics, because here we have a membrane. If you think of, the glass as a membrane, here we have a membrane, say, of plastic. In this case was a PVC membrane that I was using with the sarcophagus. And then when you excite that membrane with sound, which is what I did, now instead of lying in the sarcophagus and making sound, I put a small speaker there and connected the speaker to an electronic oscillator so I could make pure tones into the speaker. And then I stretched this membrane across the open top of the sarcophagus, having first repaired temporarily the broken away corner, in order to then reveal whatever resonances were becoming apparent in that sarcophagus with the sound. The sound would excite the granite. The granite has this high percentage of quartz crystal, so it becomes very excited, and it then changes the character of that sound that you put in. So if I put in a very pure tone from this electronic oscillator, what we hear back is not a pure tone anymore. It's complex because of the quartz crystals, right? So that was essentially the design of the experiment, to make visible the resonances in the granite sarcophagus. However, the great gift, which I'm about to mention here, Heather, is 3 weeks before traveling out to Egypt to conduct these cymatics experiments in the King's Chamber, I quite badly injured my lower back. I'm a tall, slim guy, and I did something really silly, and I bent down at an angle to lift something, and oh my goodness, the pain. And it was really excruciating. And for 3 weeks, I took analgesics, like popping them like M&Ms, and I went to a physiotherapist a couple of times. Nothing really touched that pain. And so I actually thought I was going to have to cancel the whole mission. But actually, Heather, it was an expensive thing. We had to pay quite a lot of money to the Egyptian authorities. And so I just thought, I'm going to have to just grit my teeth and bear this pain. And so I did. And other people carried the equipment, into the, when I checked it in the airport and so on. Eventually, anyway, I did get into the pyramid that day. Other people carried in the equipment. The antiquities inspector helped me to set up the experiment very kindly. And so in great pain, I managed to set up this experiment. But what happened, there was two things really that happened that day that were completely life-changing. The first was that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs began to appear in the sand that I had sprinkled on the membrane, right? And oh my goodness, the antiquities inspector, who at this point he'd helped to set up the equipment, but now he had moved off and he was standing against the north wall. I never forget the image in my, it's kind of, unforgettable. He was filing his nails and looking across at me with a kind of bored expression. And I could kind of read what he was thinking almost. He was saying, this crazy Englishman, these people, they want to do all these strange things, but, he's paid us a lot of money.
He's indulging you.
He's not really doing any harm, to the sarcophagus. Let him have his playtime, And this is kind of the look that was on his face. But now, this particular frequency that I was injecting into the sarcophagus, suddenly this ancient Egyptian hieroglyph appeared in the middle of the membrane, and it was the backbone, the jed pillar, the backbone of the god Osiris, basically, right? It wasn't static. It wasn't static, Heather. It was snaking. It was, writhing. It was just like a vertebra that if you're doing yoga postures, you know how your spine changes its curvature. It was just like that. And now the antiquities inspector, he ran across because he could see from where he was standing, and he said, "How you do that? How you do that?" And I just shrugged my shoulders. I had never expected to see anything like that. What I expected, Heather, and what is very typical, especially with cymatic patterns on membranes, like plastic membranes like this, typically geometric patterns, very beautiful. If you put a harmonious sound in to a membrane of that nature, then you will see a very symmetrical kind of geometric pattern, typically, right? And that's what I had expected. And I thought, I'll go back to my lab after I've got all these photographs, and I will I'll be doing research to discover more about the resonant properties of the sarcophagus through these geometric patterns. That was what I was thinking. But that's not what happened. I saw not just one ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, but after this, several hieroglyphs appeared. And now the antiquities inspector wanted to help. How can I help you? What can I do? Now he was engaged. He could see that there was value in what I was doing. And so he would be scraping the sand off, which, by the way, we had collected outside the pyramid. He was scraping the sand off, and then we would, sprinkle on fresh sand, change the frequency of the signal generator, and then, a new pattern would emerge. Now, I have to say that not every frequency created a hieroglyph. Many of the frequencies created very strange kind of otherworldly like shapes, like kind of, well, coral seas, I think is the only way I can really describe them, really odd patterns, and but no structure in them. And then change the frequency just a little bit more, suddenly that would disappear, and there would be another hieroglyph. And it was, and of course, I was taking photos. In those days, it was film camera. It was the very, very early days of digital cameras, and I didn't want low resolution photographs, so I took an actual film camera. And of course, in those days, there was a certain amount of, prayer that the film would develop, and of course it did. And so we have all this evidence of these hieroglyphs. And then about 20 minutes into making these amazing images appear, suddenly I realized I had no pain in my lower back. The pain had completely vanished. And in the moment when that happened, I remember now, all these years later, thinking, I know what this is. My bloodstream is flowing with endorphins. These are endogenous opioids, basically. Your brain will create opioids when you're in a peak excitement state. If you have a peak experience, you will receive opioids automatically in your body. And it kind of gives you a euphoria. And a lot of people, love this. You wouldn't, having a euphoric feeling. And it's natural. If you get excited and you're feeling great beauty of a scene, or beauty in music, whatever it is that gives you this feeling of peak experience, you will receive these endorphins in your bloodstream, and it gives one a wonderful feeling. So, and it also masks pain. That's another thing that these endogenous opioids do. Pain is, banished, usually, pretty much. In this case, no pain whatsoever, right? And I thought, these are opioids, or these are endorphins. And when I get back outside the pyramid and back to the hotel, the pain will come back. I really thought that is what would happen, because I had this pain for 3 weeks, don't forget. And I'd been taking all these, painkillers. Nothing had touched that pain. And so that's what I thought. Anyway, boy, was I proven wrong. because, after this amazing series of experiments, packing up the equipment, I felt no pain. I even was able to help carry it out of the pyramid, right? Whereas before, the only thing I carried in was my camera. Literally, that was it. I couldn't carry anything. I was in so much pain. And so I realized in that moment, there's something, reflecting back on it, once you got to the hotel and there was no pain, I realized it's something really special had happened there, Heather. Two things really. One was, why did that pain disappear? What was the biological mechanism that underpinned that amazing healing? I had to call it a healing. And then the other aspect to it was that the cymatics experiment had been so phenomenally successful that it spoke to me. It said to me, this could be a new tool for science. If we can make hieroglyphs visible from an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus, what else can we do? That's what it said. And so here we are today. We now have the Cymascope instrument, which can make sound visible very accurately. It's a calibrated scientific instrument. And actually, normally I would have one behind me here, but I've got an experiment running right now. So we didn't have room for it on the lab bench here, but normally you would see it right behind me here. It's a beautiful instrument to behold. It's beautiful to look at, but also highly functional. And whereas originally, when I first started development of the Cymascope instrument, it was literally in those days a membrane. It was actually a latex membrane on which I would sprinkle particulate matter of some kind. But I very quickly discovered, after about 2 years of work, I discovered that this was not the future of cymatics. We had to use a liquid in order to gain much more definition and also kind of quasi 3D features. When you have particulate matter on a membrane, it's very two-dimensional. Whereas I knew there was a whole lot of data that we were missing through that process. So now, having worked for many years to discover how best to image sound in water, we ended up with pure water. So, other liquids had been tried. I tried alcohols and even whiskey at one point. And there's a benefit there, of course, because you can have a little tipple, after. But, it turned out, none of these liquids performed as well as pure water, and the purer the better. So now we use triple distilled water. This is the kind of water that is used in hospitals for cleaning wounds or for, injecting into arteries or veins, where it's required to be ultra pure. And so it has no what's termed solutes. There's no suspended particles, right? It's very, very pure. And this is needed from to calibrate the instrument to make sure that what sound we inject into the instrument always creates the same pattern, basically, with that same frequency or frequencies. And so that's what we use now. So it's a beautiful instrument to behold, but also highly functional. And, my darling Annalise, she said many years ago, when I was first, we got to, Annalise is, as you know, is an American, but now living with her husband in Britain. And but Annalise watched a lot of this work going on, of this early development work with the Cymascope instrument. And she said many years ago that it's like it's like a portal where you're looking into another dimension. And just recently, Heather, I've been doing some imaging work, which was actually commissioned work for a client. And he had sent me a range of very, very low frequencies. These are all very special numbers that he had figured out, he calculated, relating to nature. And oh my goodness, I have never seen what we call cymaglyphs, the word that we now use for sound image. I have never seen cymaglyphs like this. These are absolutely extraordinary. And it is just like, it's exactly what Annalise was saying. It's like looking into a portal into another world, another dimension, another universe in a sense. and they're just so extraordinary. And I've said to this gentleman who, has commissioned these frequencies to be made visible, that really there should be an exhibition where these cymaglyphs are printed out in large scale, maybe like a yard or a meter square, quite large, to get the full effect of them in an actual exhibition where people can go and literally view them, because they are so extraordinary. And it just shows, that this world that we take so much for granted in this world, we see what we see with our senses, we think is reality, but actually we're only seeing just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, in terms of what is there in nature. We see a very, very small part of it. And the Cymascope, as we now know, is opening up other aspects of nature that have always been there, but they've been latent, they've been hidden from us, really, because our senses are just inadequate, you could say, to see all of nature. So now we're able to glimpse these other aspects of nature, and oh my goodness, they're just so beautiful when you see them. And I really, would love to. I hope that I can work with this client to collaborate and to bring them out into the world in a way that everyone can enjoy and be as amazed and fascinated as we are by them, because they are just so extraordinary.
It's amazing. And it's amazing to me that the breadth of and range of what you can do with the Cymascope. But circling back to what you just said, it does feel like it is a portal into seeing into another dimension, and that realization that everything is vibration, everything is sound. And the
Yes.
Cymascope and what you're doing with these images of the vibrations of nature is revealing that harmonic that permeates the natural world, that is the songs of the spheres, that it's allowing us to see it and remember it. And as you and I were talking about before the recording, I find looking at some of those images moves me to tears. It's like it triggers some deep remembrance
It
of
does the same for me. And, one of the aspects that I always, when I'm giving a lecture, I always like to make certain that I share with everyone that's listening or watching, that these beautiful cymaglyphs, these cymatic patterns that we see imprinted in the macro scale in the Cymascope instrument. I should really get just give me 1 second here. Here is one of the what we term a cuvette, and you can see it's got a black bottom, and this on the bottom is a little leveling platform, so we can make certain that it's absolutely perfectly level when we start the experiment. So that gets filled with water, and then obviously the sound comes up through this spigot here and literally imprints the water. Now, I think the reason I wanted to share this with you, I want to show this to you and everyone that's watching this, if you can now think of that relatively small volume of water there, but when sound enters into that water, within a fraction of a second, a tiny fraction of a second, all of the trillions and trillions and trillions of water molecules in that cuvette are beautifully organized, in this blink of an eye, right, into great beauty and organization, where prior to that, they'd all been happily going about under Brownian motion, just kind of moving around, getting knocked backwards and forwards by the heat and so on. That's what Brownian motion does. It causes the particles to kind of do a little jitterbug, but there's no organization, right? It's all chaotic. Soon as sound enters into the picture, great beauty, as long as the sound is harmonic. I should caveat that. If the sound is harmonic, in other words, beautifully balanced, where every frequency is numerically related to every other frequency, then great beauty emerges in the blink of an eye, right? Now, what I always hope to share in my talks and lectures with everyone is that when sound that's around us, say sounds of nature or we're immersed in a musical environment, whether that be recorded music or, live music, however it is, that will literally enter into our body, into our visceral waters. And so the same principle that applies in this little cuvette now applies in our physiology. And not just organizing the visceral waters in our body, but also remember the principle of cymatics, that whenever there is a membrane and there's a sound present, there must be a cymatic pattern imprinted by the laws of physics, right? Now think of the trillions of cells in our body that have a membrane, right? And so what happens when sound enters into our body, or music, and if we're talking music, then beautiful cymatic patterns literally wrap themselves around every cell membrane. This is one of the laws of physics. And, one of the interesting aspects to cymatics is that this law of physics applies regardless of scale. If you go online and you look up a giant hexagon on Saturn, the planet Saturn, you will find there's a giant hexagon on the North Pole of the planet Saturn, so large that it could swallow 3 Earths. That's how big it is, right? And it's caused by cymatic forces. There's a circular storm traveling at, 1,000 miles an hour, huge storm, right? And it forms what's termed a palisade or a boundary condition, and basically causes a cymatic pattern. I'll not go into all the complexities of that, but it's essentially a cymatic pattern. Then another way that you can look at nature and see cymatic patterns, if you use a search engine and you put in hexagonal craters on the moon, or hexagonal craters on some of the moons of other planets, like Saturn's moons and so on, what you'll find is that some craters are hexagonal, for example, right? Now, obviously, this is, not general knowledge. Most people think that all craters are essentially circular. It's not true. They're not. If you go on a search engine, look for these, you'll find hexagonal craters. And why does this happen? Well, as a meteor or meteorite comes down to the planet, in this case, the moon, surface of the moon, and strikes the moon, well, normally it would just create a circular hole, basically, and a palisade of rock and dust will form in a circular fashion. But with the principle of cymatics is that when sound, let's say we talk about, again, this little cuvette, sound will always enter the central area, the epicenter first, and then it will travel out to the boundary, and then it will reflect from the boundary back towards the epicenter, at which point a beautiful pattern will emerge, as the outward waves merge with the incoming waves. That's when the interference between the two creates the pattern, right? Which is a function of the frequencies that you've injected in the first place. Well, what happens with a meteorite as it's striking the surface of the planet? Normally, for sure, it will create a circular crater. But under certain circumstances, the speed at which the energy is trying to move away from the epicenter will be slowed down by the structure in the rocks and the dust and so on the surface of the moon. And some of it will start getting reflected back towards the epicenter because of this, the rate at which the energy can travel out. Sometimes it's hindered and it starts to come back. And when that happens, then the crater becomes effectively a giant hexagon or some other polygon, and creates a cymatic pattern, basically. So I'm just mentioning these two particular celestial versions of cymatics to mention that scale is irrelevant. And we have, in this very lab here, image sounds on the surface, not of human cells yet, but we've imaged them on plant cells and also in the microscopic scale, and huge beauty, great beauty in something you can't even see with the naked eye. But if you're looking at it under our microscope here on a slide, and you've got microscopic droplets of water, they're called sessile drops, then these beautiful cymatic patterns emerge, right? And so this is the same principle that I'm referring to here, by which cymatic patterns appear on our cell membranes, which is something, I'd like to work with in future experiments where I'm literally looking at my own cells with sound under a microscope. So the reason I'm mentioning all of this, Heather, is because, some people might say, well, so what? It's interesting, but does it have any benefit? Well, yes, it does. And there are many different mechanisms, biological mechanisms, that are triggered by this very process that I'm now referring to. One of them I like to refer to as Sleeping Beauty and the kiss of the prince. The story of the prince and Sleeping Beauty, how the princess is awakened by the kiss of the prince. Well, this is very similar actually to what happens in one's body if there's a pathogen enters into our system, or if we imbibe some toxic substance, then a system of cells can go to sleep in your body. And this is called, in medical terms, called the G0 phase of the cell cycle. This is a phase of the cell where the cell is no longer replicating. It's not, going through its normal mitosis process. It's just basically asleep. It's like in a kind of coma, you could say, and it's waiting for something to happen to waken it. Now, this process is a natural part of the biology in every human being and in animals, of course. And what happens, the body is an exquisitely in a delicate balance, a homeostasis in which every system of the body has to be working in harmony, in balance. And if one part of that system, that complex system, goes out of balance because some part of the system is asleep, right? You can imagine what happens. It suddenly knocks the whole balance of the body out, and you feel ill because this system of your body is not working as it's supposed to, right? It's literally asleep. Well, if you research the medical literature, you'll find that the essentially three things that are needed to fix this situation. One of them is sleep. An MD will sometimes say to his or her patient, you need a good rest. You need plenty of sleep. And there's actually a lot of truth in that, because sleep is really great medicine. The body can heal itself far better when it's in that mode than when you're awake, for sure. And so there's a lot of truth in that. Another thing that you can read in the literature to reawaken these G0 system of cells is nutrition. A good injection of nutrition or hydration, adequate hydration in the body can also help to reawaken these sleeping cells, these sleeping beauties. But of course, what I'm referring to now is sound frequencies can do exactly the same thing. And the reason that they're able to do it is because it's a form of nutrition. It's a form of energy. Sound is a form of energy, of course. But in this case, it's a beautiful form that appears on the surface membrane of all of your cells, including the cells that are asleep. Now, from the surface membrane of every cell in your body, excepting your brain cells, but all the other cells, as you know, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of little integral membrane proteins that project from the cell membrane. And these little proteins are there's different types of proteins, but these are all methods by which the cell communicates with its brother and sister cells around it. It's the way that the cell will receive nutrients. It's the way that it will excrete waste products and so on. All of these little IMPs are projecting like little antennas for all the world, right? Well, you can now imagine what happens when sound frequencies come into the body and wrap themselves around, manifest as cymatic patterns around the cell membranes, then you can now see that the antinodes, these are the areas of the pattern that are most vibrating, they will tweak the little IMPs that are projecting, right? Literally giving them a massage. And one of the aspects of music that is, not many people talk about, but from an acoustics engineering point of view or acoustic physics point of view is very well known, that music has phase changes happening in it all of the time. And what this means is, because the frequencies in music are always complex and mixing and mingling, so phase changes are happening. And what it means from a cymatics point of view is that these patterns that are manifesting on your cell membranes are not static. They're rotating gently as the music phases change, so the pattern is rotating. Well, now you can imagine that all these little IMPs are getting a beautiful massage. And this is actually a form of energy that then can just tip the scales and allow the cell to reawaken, to rejoin the cell cycle. And then the cell will go through other stages of, the G1 phase and so on until it reaches this stage of mitosis, division, and it's back to normal health again. And this is all possible simply because of sound. And so some people would say to me, well, how do we know, which frequencies are needed? What are the optimal frequencies? And this is a really good question. And the truth of it is, the truthful answer is that no one actually knows for sure. And the reason for that is because no one has actually conducted that research. It was started in 2002 by Dr. James Jimzewski of UCLA. He was using an atomic force microscope to literally listen to the sounds of cells that for the first time ever, right? And so he was the discoverer of what he terms sonocytology, which is the sound of cells. And every cell in your body has thousands of processes going on inside it every second, and all of these metabolic processes cause the membrane of the cell to vibrate and literally create sound, right? And he poetically termed this the song of the cell. So obviously the song of the cell is what we would really optimally want to play back to that cell, isn't it? To reawaken it, as it were. But no one has done that research. He stopped that field of study, and I'm not sure why. I've never been able to establish why he didn't continue it. And the instrument that's needed to do this work, and I'd love to do it myself, if someone would just kind of give me $250,000 to buy the instrument, right? And it's not, by the way, it's not atomic force microscopy. It's not the way that I would want to do it. There's another system called coherent Raman spectroscopy, which is how I would do it. But anyway, it's the same, essentially, it would be a way of listening in to the sounds of cells. And atomic force microscopy is much more difficult and really not user-friendly, you could say. I don't know if that was involved in, no, I suppose not. But anyway, I would love to do that. But the truth is, Heather, you don't need to know the frequencies. I mean, it'd be lovely to know them, but this is why we don't need to know them, is because all we need to do is to immerse ourselves in a soundscape that is harmonically rich and has thousands and thousands of frequencies. Well, to give an example of what I'm referring to here, there's no better instrument than the gong to provide these thousands of frequencies. Now, some people would say, well, isn't the gong just noise? No, not from a scientific viewpoint. It is a type of noise, but it's a musical noise, right? It has thousands and thousands of frequencies. On our laboratory spectrum analyzer, it goes all the way from, our analyzer goes down to 4 hertz, basically, and up to 31.5 kilohertz. And it covers the whole spectrum, right? right through the whole spectrum of a large gong, by the way. I'm not talking about little gongs, but a large gong. So, gong baths are a wonderful way to be healed, because if we immerse ourselves in that environment, we are soaking up, our cells are soaking up these thousands of frequencies. Now, the caveat here is that it must be of moderate sound pressure level. If it's too loud, if the gong is played too loudly, it would literally stress our cells. Instead of it being healing, it would actually do the opposite. It would cause stress to the cells, because the cells have a certain amount of mechanism to reject sounds that they don't want, but only up to a certain limit. Beyond that, it literally causes them stress. So we don't want to be doing that. At the same time, the experiments that we've conducted here with Professor Sung-Chul Ji, where we worked with human blood, for example, showed that very low sound pressure levels have virtually no beneficial effect. So in other words, if we're talking the kind of Goldilocks zone that I usually refer to is between 70 dBA, decibels, up to 85. In that range, 70 to 85, then you're going to receive really beautiful healing frequencies. Below 70, it's like tickling your cells. They're not really going to be benefit. They're not going to receive benefit. It's too quiet, basically. If it's above 85, you're starting to get into a danger zone where there's, risk of stress to the cells. But in that range, 70 to 85, you're going to receive beautiful healing frequencies. And how do you know that this is so? Well, everyone, well, not everyone, but, many people have smartphones these days. This is an iPhone, but, Samsung Galaxy or whatever, all of these different types of smartphones, you can buy, actually, they're virtually, most of them are free now, a sound level meter for your phone, right? So some of them are free.
Make sure you're in that right range.
Make sure you're in that right range, so you have it on your body. Obviously, you have and the app's working, and you can see the gong master there is playing the gong, and you're having a quick look. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, we're safe. We're safe. We're in the right zone.
This is extraordinary, John. And basically what you're saying then is the sound and the harmonics are reminding the cells how to wake up and come back into harmony and balance. And with that range of frequencies, they're all getting activated to remember how to come back into harmony. But you are really brilliantly pioneering this understanding that sound therapy can be a powerful form of natural healing. That rather, talk more about that, because you really see sound and light therapy as the healing of the future.
Well, for sure it is. I mean, in my mind, there's absolutely no doubt about that. The challenge, I've seen this for many years now, the challenge, not just, in my research, but in many other researchers, of breaking into the mainstream medical model and causing change within it. Well, the good news is that I have begun to see that change. It's very slow change. It was actually a friend and colleague of mine, Shamini Jain, who told me there's something I didn't know, which was that there's a 17-year gap between evidence and practice in mainstream medicine. This means, researchers finding the evidence for some new, whatever it is, method, some method of healing or therapy, and it actually becoming something that could be, used in a hospital setting, for example. 17 years, which is absolutely pretty astonishing. But there are two areas that I could mention immediately where I've seen change happen. One of them is in the rheumatology departments of hospitals, where now routinely light therapy, which is the technical term is photobiomodulation, fancy term for what's basically light, is now being used routinely in rheumatology departments, right? And this is, if we use the the umbrella term frequency medicine, right? Then light therapy, photobiomodulation, comes under that umbrella. So now mainstream medicine is using an aspect of frequency medicine. So, and not just, the different colors of light have different therapeutic effects. So the effect of red light is perhaps the most powerful and predominant light that's used. But there are other light colors, other light frequencies is what they are, of course. Like blue light has a different effect to red light, has a different effect to green light, and so on. These different colors of light are used for different skin conditions in mainstream medicine now. Another really great sign, Heather, is the new term used now by many clinicians around the world, music medicine, right? Mm-hmm. So we've known, well, we're all familiar with I think everyone will have heard of music therapy. Music therapy is, a tried and tested modality. Yes, used in the mainstream, has been since the 1950s, actually, when it really first started to take off. And here we are, a lifetime later, and it's still on the rise. Music therapists, are trained. It's a diploma that you have to be a music therapist. And if you're a music therapist, you work with a patient, helping them to choose the music that they love themselves. But also, there's a large involvement of talk therapy involved. It's a kind of psychology, you could say, but it's also, of course, using music. Well, and it's very powerful, by the way. However, there can never be enough music therapists to go around. There are millions of people in hospitals all over the world, in hospital patients now in the world, and yet, probably a few thousand trained music therapists, right? So there's a disconnect there that will never, in my view, will never be filled. You're never going to have enough music therapists to go around. And so, lo and behold, medical science has discovered that music has therapeutic benefits even without the therapist being present, right? That's not to discount the work of the therapist, by the way, because they do great work. But, just the knowledge that now mainstream medicine has finally recognized that music has powerful therapeutic value even without the psychological aspect. So it's literally, as music enters into our body, just like, that mechanism that I mentioned, the G0 phase, the Sleeping Beauty and the Kiss of the Prince, that's only one of many different mechanisms that I could refer to where music is literally, or the frequencies of music are literally doing the work of, causing a reversal of symptoms, literally a healing of the body. Now, one of them, I think that I don't know how much time we've got, Heather, but one that really I must, at least share with everyone here is how I was healed in the Great Pyramid, right? Because I
was hoping we could circle back to this. Yes.
Coming back to that, right? Absolutely. So it turns out that most of the healing of my lower back had already happened in the 3 weeks, from the injury to actually traveling out to Egypt. Most of the healing, this is the way that, I've now understood what happened to me that day. Most of the healing had happened, but there's a mechanism called the pain-spasm-pain cycle, which is what I was experiencing that day. So the healing had virtually already happened, but when one has a spinal injury particularly, there's a mechanism that causes it's also called the splinting cycle. You know how if you have a broken bone, a clinician will splint that arm or that leg so that it doesn't move while the bone is trying to heal, right? So this is a way of immobilizing, that fracture or break in the bone. Well, your body will do a very similar thing, actually. If you have a spinal injury, the spina erecta muscles will go into a spasm. This is a mechanism that the body automatically begins for you without any, it's all autonomic. Nothing you can do about it. It will just happen. And that spasm is extremely painful. It's actually more painful than the original injury, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Why? Because when you have an extreme pain, it's really a way for your body to alert you, hey, you've got a problem here. You better take care, right? You better not move this area because it's trying to heal. Or, it's similar kind of message is being given to your consciousness. It's telling you to take care or to take action or both. Well, in my case, when I was going into the pyramid that day, my spina erector muscles were in deep spasm, causing extreme pain. And if I can give you the analogy now of why this pain happens, if I now give you the analogy of a cramp, I think probably most you and probably most everyone watching this has had a cramp in some part of their body at some point in their lives. And it's essentially what happens is when a muscle cramps, it usually does so because of lack of oxygen. Now, this is a what they call hypoxia situation, where there's not enough oxygen to feed the muscle. And so the muscle, unfortunately, goes into a spasm mode. And when it does that, or cramp mode, and when it does that, you can now imagine that when a muscle tightens up, it squeezes out even more blood, right, than before. And this is why when a muscle goes into cramp, it's a kind of ramp. You feel the muscle tightening and tightening and tightening even more and more and more, and the pain gets more and more intense, right? With a cramp, of course, we can take physical action. If our leg is cramped, we can put pressure on the foot or, whatever it is to loosen this cramp. In my case, I could do nothing about it because it was literally the spina erector muscles were saying, you will not move your spine. This is healing happening, right? And it's basically a hypoxic situation where the muscles are deliberately starved of oxygen in order to cramp them and in order to splint the spine and to splint that injury cycle, that injury site, so that it cannot be moved while that healing is taking place, right? Isn't it amazing how the body works? All of these mechanisms that we have that we are completely unaware of usually. Anyway, in my case, the discovery that Professor G and I made when we were working with human blood a few years ago in the lab here provided the answer to the puzzle. How was my back apparently magically healed, in 20 minutes when no amount of painkillers had analgesics, or physiotherapists working with me had been able to touch it? Well, this is the reason now I'm going to share with everyone, with you and everyone, because it's kind of magical in a way. Professor G and I were working with human blood because of an intuition that I'd had many years ago, that I was thinking about Pythagoras and his Pythagoras of Samos and his assertion or his belief that music could be used in place of medicine. You're probably familiar with that. And it was his biographer, Iamblichus, who wrote those words down, reported, what Pythagoras had said. Pythagoras's writings, unfortunately, are no longer extant. They're not available to us. But he had many biographers, and Iamblichus was one of them, and he wrote these words down. And I came to realize that it almost certainly was true, but where's the evidence for it? Where's the clinical evidence? Where's the biological evidence to substantiate that claim? And so I had this dream one day, a daydream in bed. I get my best ideas often in bed when I'm just waking up. And this said, we should be working with human blood to test this hypothesis because it's easily available, it's readily available. And so this is what we did. And so Professor G came here. He's from Rutgers University. He's now emeritus, but he was, a practicing professor then. And And we worked for several days to design a protocol. And the essence of it was exactly what I'm now doing here, actually, because it involved today, literally in this same series of experiments, but more advanced now. So you have a vial of blood that is placed into an incubator, like you see here. And can you see in the incubator, there's a small speaker? Can you see that?
Yes.
So now we can play music to that blood. And so we take a test tube of blood from a blood bank. It arrives chilled, and we warm it up to blood temperature, decant it into two smaller test tubes. One test tube goes in this incubator. The other test tube goes in the laboratory Faraday cage, which is an electromagnetically screened little room. You can walk into it and you close the door. It's very, very quiet in there because it's acoustically lined to be so. And so this is our control experiment, you could say, where we have one vial in that very quiet environment. The other vial is receiving music. And of course, we then do a test with our various counters. So we've got a white blood cell counter. We've got a red blood cell counter. We can automatically count how many red blood cells or white blood cells are viable from the quiet environment, which is the baseline, and how many after receiving the music. Well, it turned out that every time, every genre of music that we used produced a significant increase in the viability of the red blood cells. In those days, it was only red. We didn't have the white blood cell counter. But it was an astonishing, to realize that, wow, just by immersing ourselves in music, we can get an increase in viability in our red blood cells. This was an astonishing discovery in itself. But what we didn't know in that moment was, what is the mechanism? What powers this mechanism, right? How is it working? Well, the clue came because we came to realize this little speaker that we're using in the incubator has a very poor, relatively poor bass response. As you can imagine, it's a small speaker, right? So small speakers, don't have great bass response, right? And so we thought, well, maybe it is the low frequencies in the music that is driving. This was a hypothesis. Maybe it's the low frequencies in the music that's driving this mechanism. How can we test this? Oh, well, we'll put some blood into the Cymascope instrument, which has a frequency response that goes down to 3 hertz, right? Well, when we did this was where the evidence came, because immediately when we put a 40 hertz tone into the blood in the Cymascope instrument, a beautiful cymatic pattern, a cymaglyph, appeared in the blood. Well, that in itself was not a surprise, because it's a liquid. Blood is a liquid. It's mostly water, right? And so, of course, we're going to see a cymatic pattern in the blood. That was not a surprise. What the surprise was, Heather, when we removed the sound, the pattern stayed in the blood. It just stayed there, right? And when the blood comes from the blood bank where we receive it from, it's very dark red. It's a kind of dark maroon color. But as soon as this cymatic pattern emerged in the blood, it was bright, bright scarlet against the dark maroon background. And it just stayed there, right? It's like, what? Astonishing. And so this was the clue, because we had hypothesized that the low frequencies drive this healing mechanism. Now here was the proof, because what was happening was the low frequencies, in this case a 40 hertz pure tone, caused the cymatic pattern to occur, to manifest, caused the hemoglobin molecules in the blood to absorb more oxygen that was already dissolved in the blood. Even though there's all this oxygen comes in the blood when you receive it from the blood bank, still the blood is dark red. Why? No pressure to cause the oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin, right? You need pressure to cause that to happen. In your body, that pressure comes from your heart. Every time there's a heartbeat, there's a pressure pulse. And this pressure pulse is sound, right? You think of this, your heartbeat, boom, boom, boom. it's literally sound that's moving through your veins and arteries and causing the hemoglobin molecules to absorb, to capture the oxygen that's already dissolved in the blood. And so that day with the Cymascope instrument, we were seeing the same effect that we would normally have in our body. We do have in our bodies, but we were seeing effectively, in the in vitro environment, where suddenly this beautiful scarlet cymatic pattern emerges and doesn't go away. Well, it does eventually. It took about 15, 20 minutes to gradually dissolve away, but essentially just stayed there, like magic. It was an astonishing moment. And so now what we know for sure is that it's the oxygen that is powering the mechanism. So yes, sound is the catalyst, you could say, but the sound isn't doing the work. The sound causes the oxygen to be bound to the hemoglobin. Then the hemoglobin is now rich with, engorged with oxygen, and it feeds the proteins in the old red blood cells to become new again within 20 minutes.
Wow.
This is it's amazing. So, literally just feeding music into blood causes the old red blood cells. You can't bring dead red blood cells back to life. They're dead, they're gone. That's it, they're finished. But they're in a test tube of blood, there's always millions and millions of old red blood cells, like just classed as medically old, right? The outer membranes are starting to lose their integrity. They're kind of starting to break up. They're not looking so pretty anymore. They haven't got that beautiful disc shape that a healthy red blood cell has. But what happened within 20 minutes, that music frequencies cause more oxygen to be available to the proteins, and suddenly the proteins are starting to repair themselves, repair the damage, and making the blood cell new again. It's a bit like the story of the genie and the lamp, new lamps for old, new lamps for old. Well, now we have new cells for old, just because of music. I mean, it is pretty astonishing. Now, in those days, it was all, when we first started doing this work, it was all red blood cells. But now we're finding that even the white blood cells are being helped, not in the same kind of percentages, by the way, as the reds, but still a few percent increase in viability, even of the white blood cells, are being caused by music. And one of the really bizarre aspects to this research that I know a lot of people are going to find really strange is that the classical music that we tested returned the very poorest results of all the music that we tested.
Interesting.
And I know it's so counterintuitive. Most people would think, and we thought, oh, classical music's bound to have the best effect on the blood. Not a bit of it. No, because, and it turns out after a long, study in this, that classical music does not have a particularly prominent low frequency register. Most classical music, mid-range frequencies predominate, and of course upper frequencies as well, but not bass, unless you're talking about the 1812 overture or something, But if you now think of popular music, boom, 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 it's just like a heartbeat. It's like a heartbeat, basically, and it's doing exactly the same as a heartbeat, exactly the same. So those low frequency pulses of sound from a speaker system, not from earphones, by the way, not from headphones, speaker system, right? They are entering our body and literally causing more oxygen to be made available. And the same with, by the way, if you think about drumming now as well, this is an ancient form of music.
Yes.
Has the same effect. Drumming, any low frequencies entering our body are doing exactly the same as what a heart will do. And so I can envision a future where in hospital settings and clinical settings, there will be special acoustic beds that people lie on to receive more low frequency energy, not in a kind of dull drone, boring way, but in a rhythmic way, like the ocean waves, throbbing through your body in a kind of beautiful rhythm that will then also help to super oxygenate your blood, remembering that oxygen is the key molecule for all of, well, almost all of the healing processes in the body. Nitric oxide, and there's other molecules that are very important, but oxygen is the key ingredient. So simply by immersing ourselves in a beautiful musical soundscape, we can be healed. And here is one of the many mechanisms. There are many others, by the way, but I thought it was important to mention the oxygen one, because of what happened for me in the Great Pyramid all those years ago.
John, it's so extraordinary and so exciting to think of that as the wave of the future for our healing. And because astrologically we're moving into the Aquarian age, which is so much about an understanding of energy and frequency and vibration, I don't think it's going to take 17 years this time. I think it's going to do rapidly. But before we have to stop, John, I would love to hear, based on that research you did in the King's Chamber, what your sense was then of what the purpose was for the King's Chamber and the resonance in the sarcophagus.
Well, my sense of it was that it was designed deliberately for a specific ritual, a sonic rebirth ritual is what I call it. There's a very, very well-known ceremony in ancient Egypt that's extremely well documented, called the opening of the mouth ceremony. This is a ceremony in which the deceased pharaoh has been mummified, is wrapped head to toe in beautiful bandages, and then he is stood up vertically. Say he, I mean the deceased pharaoh is stood up vertically, and then they use a special device called a Peshen Kef instrument, which slices open the bandages of the mouth. And this is actually, it's harking back to midwifery, basically, where when a baby is born, the midwife would often use her little finger, put it into the mouth of the child, the baby, to remove any mucus and basically make sure that the airway is clear. This is part of how a baby is born, or was in those days anyway. And in a similar way, the opening of the mouth ceremony was harking back to birth, and indeed in this case rebirth, because of course the ancient Egyptians were very big into rebirth. They very strongly believed in it. And so this was a ceremony in which the new pharaoh, the incoming pharaoh, would be essentially take on the Horus self of the dead pharaoh, of the deceased pharaoh, and the way that this was happening symbolically was that they were reanimating, as it's called, the deceased pharaoh by slitting open its bandages. And I don't know whether they actually put a finger in, but it's part of the ceremony anyway. And so I envision this ritual, this opening of the mouth ritual, being part of this sonic rebirth ceremony. And have you seen that beautiful painting that Judith Page created for us of this rebirth ritual happening? It's a beautiful painting. I did a sketch originally to show what I had envisioned. I mean, this is not necessarily true, of course. This is, an idea that I'd conceptualized. I did a sketch. I gave it to Judith. She's a wonderful artist, and she created this. She painted in oils this beautiful painting showing 4 tonsured priests. So these are, shaved heads, wearing beautiful white gowns. And then there's the Sem priest who's wearing the traditional leopard skin gown, and he's standing there directing them. And these 4 priests have their fingertips resting very gently on the edge of the sarcophagus. So it's all happening in the king's chamber, obviously. And the new pharaoh is literally lying in the sarcophagus, making sound. And when he reaches the prime resonant frequency of the sarcophagus, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, but it's 117 hertz, which is actually, in musical terms, very close to a B flat. But it's 117 anyway. And so when that frequency, vocal frequency, is reached, the whole sarcophagus will start to resonate, and they will sense this through their fingertips. So instead of using electronics instrumentation, which they didn't have, they can use their own bodies, to sense this moment. And so this is the what I envisioned, and so anyway, Judith, made this beautiful painting. I think it's on our website in the Egyptology section. Actually, I'm pretty sure it is. And if you go there, I'm sure you'll see it. If not, you can come back to me, and I'll be happy to send a copy of it.
I would love to see it, but yes, so it sounds like it was this whole spiritual initiation process.
Indeed, where sound was a key element, and this is why they went to so much trouble. When you think about the hundreds and hundreds of tons of granite that they used, they could have used limestone. Tura limestone was readily available in Giza, where the Great Pyramids have been built. No, we're going to get granite. My God, it's so hard to, it's so difficult to quarry, and it was hundreds of miles away, and yet they did all of that consciously, right? And this is, in my view, this is the reason, because they wanted to create this astonishing acoustic, and by golly, they did. It's fantastic, as you know.
Well, it's extraordinary, John. You've drawn on some of that ancient wisdom and understanding, but you're such a pioneer in terms of guiding us into the possibilities with sound therapy, sound healing. And I want to strongly encourage people to check out your website, cymascope.com. It's extraordinary, the information that you have there and the range of uses of the Cymascope for so many fields. So thank you for the amazing work that you're doing, John, and taking this time to share it with us.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure, Heather. And the thing is that you are helping to spread this knowledge out into the world, and I'm deeply grateful to you for inviting me onto your podcast. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and blessings and love to all of you listening.
Bye-bye, everyone.